I'm Peter Bock at TCT in Washington, D.C. Standing next to me is Susheel Kodali from Colombia. Susheel has been the major domo of TAVR and now is talking about the Sentinel trial, or has talked about the Sentinel trial. A very important trial about embolic protection. Susheel, tell me about the trial and then, of course, the outcomes.
Sure. So stroke is still a big complication. This trial randomized 3 different arms, embolic protection or no, with TAVR. It used multiple different valve types as they got approved in the U.S. What the trial showed is stroke is still a real problem. Probably in this trial with neurologists seeing the patients, stroke rates combined were over 7%.
Wow, let me just interrupt because that's more than what we have heard in the past.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, when neurologists see patients and, stroke rates are higher than when cardiologists see patients, and I think some of it is that, but it shows that stroke is still a problem. And with the Sentinel device, which is a dual filter device, it's placed typically from the right radial, one filter in the innominate, one filter in the right carotid. It protects the significant percentage of the brain, but not the entire brain. It's placed before any wire crosses the aortic valve, and it's removed after the TAVR is deployed. What we showed in this trial, which is that the device is safe to insert. When you looked at MACE rates, they were lower compared to historical performance goal, and they were lower compared to the control arm. What we saw was strokes were numerically lower in Sentinel, but didn't meet statistical significance, 5.6 versus 9.1. And the vascular complications with placing the device, there was one major vascular associated with placement of the device. The primary efficacy endpoint, just because of sheer numbers, we can't power to a clinical endpoint. It was a surrogate endpoint with new lesions, median new lesion volume on DW MRI. And what we showed, again, similar to before, is a 42% reduction in median new lesion volume, but again, it didn't reach statistical significance. We looked for confounders, and there was an interaction by valve type. Non-Sapien 3 valves had higher rates of embolic events even in the control population. Now, there's challenges with that. I mean, we looked at all baseline variables across the valve types, calcium scores and things. They weren't different, but there's probably, you can't account for why an operator decided to use a Evolut versus Sapien 3. Maybe use Evolut in more calcified valves, and so they're probably confounders. Regardless, there was an interaction between valve type and treatment arm, which was significant. And the other significant variable that we found is patients' baseline burden of white matter disease, because we had a baseline MRI in every patient, was the strongest predictor of new lesion volume.
Well, that's fascinating. Yeah. I mean, so should we do MRIs before we do a TAVR?
Well, I guess it's challenging, but even in the low baseline lesion and high, there was a benefit in both. It was just the magnitudes were different. And the baseline lesion volume is an uncontrollable thing. The patient has what they have. And stroke is unpredictable, so I think that's the challenge, right? If we knew who was an identifiable, and there are populations that are high risk, like valve and valve, historically in all trials have shown higher risk of stroke, heavy LVT calcium, mobile atheroma. Those patients are probably clinically higher risk, and maybe in those patients especially, embolic protection would have a strong role. But in terms of applying a score, we don't have anything yet. But when you adjust for those confounders, there was a significant reduction in the lesion volume.
Yeah. Well, a little bit of a disappointment. You look at this and say, really? I mean, it makes so much sense, right? And yet the p-values don't come out. So I guess the question is, what's next?
I mean, I think one of the questions is this simply is this an inconclusive trial and the study's underpowered? Did we not adjust for the right confounders? Are there, valve type differences? I think those are the questions. Now, we could do another trial, but there are challenges with that. But there's also been 2 other randomized trials using this similar system. So I think if we could maybe potentially pool the data, the MRIs are analyzed by the same core lab, and start looking at it more closely, we might get some more evidence and see if simply a power issue or not.
Okay, so a disappointment for embolic protection to start with, but maybe not so much of a disappointment when you look more carefully and drill down into the data. And there are other things pending that may give us some answers going forward. So keep your eye on this. This is not a dead issue. And candidly, if I were to guess, I can't imagine this isn't going to work. It's got to work.
Exactly.
So we'll see whether or not the data support my silliness here, but I certainly hope that we'll learn about this in the future as well. Thank you, Susheel.
Thank you very much.